Let's go back to your finger on the pulse of the Russian people. Are you able to draw from that an opinion of what they think of American hatred for President Putin and all things Russian?
The Russian people, to be honest, are at least the ones I talk to, and I talk to many. It's a big nation, 150 plus million. So, I was able to interact with several hundred, maybe a few thousand. So draw your conclusions as you see fit. But they were from a wide spectrum of Russian society: rich, middle class, poor, vehemently pro-Putin supporters, people who weren't so pro-Putin supporters, and there's a lot of them. Not anti-Russian, they're pro-Russian, but as they say, we have questions. We have a lot of questions. But one of the biggest questions they have is, what is the source of the American angst, of the American anger? Right. They don't understand it. They would understand if they had done something to offend America, if they had done, but the only thing that they can come up with that they've done that offends America is survive. And from a Russian perspective, they're not willing to sacrifice their survival to appease America. Russia's not trying to defeat us, and I hope everybody understands that. It is not a central objective of Russia to defeat either the United States or NATO. They just want to survive, and a key element of their survival is to ensure that Ukraine does not become part of NATO and does not become a full-time cancer that sucks away Russian national vitality. Russia is going to win this war. It's of existential importance to them.
Here is a tape of one of the cheerleaders for Russian hatred, Secretary of State Blinken. I'll be anxious to hear your thoughts on it. This is just about 24 hours old.
As I've made clear by virtually every measure, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic failure. Yet, while Putin has failed to achieve his aims, he hasn't given up on them. He's convinced that he can simply outlast Ukraine and its supporters, sending more and more Russians to their deaths, inflicting more and more suffering on Ukraine's civilians. He thinks that even if he loses the short game, he can still win the long game. Putin is wrong about this, too. The United States, together with our allies and partners, is firmly committed to supporting Ukraine's defense today, tomorrow, for as long as it takes.
To what end, Tony?
I'm always amazed when people of Secretary Blinken's stature and alleged intelligence make statements such as, Putin believes, Putin thinks, Putin. Really, Tony? You know this? I mean, because did Putin get on the phone call and say, hey, Tony, I believe this, I think this? Because I'm somebody who follows Putin, and I follow his statements. I follow what he says, what he writes. Nothing that Putin has ever articulated comes close to mirroring what Blinken is saying. Blinken is making things up out of whole cloth. He says that Russia, by no measurement can we say Russia has achieved its strategic objectives. One of the key strategic objectives of this conflict, and remember, war is an extension of politics by other means, so people have to look beyond the battlefield, is to bring an end to American hegemony and to bring to breathe life into a multipolar global reality. Well, I don't know, Tony. Take a look at BRICS, the expansion of BRICS, the economic group that is challenging, has surpassed the G7 in terms of global relevance. Take a look at Russia's diplomatic standing around the world. Everywhere except in the West, Russia ranks higher than the United States. Russian currency before the sanctions could not be used to purchase or do transactions globally. Russian currency today is part of a basket of currencies being used to challenge the petrodollar. Russia is defeating the United States strategically from a geopolitical and economic standpoint. And we've already talked about the battlefield, where the Russian military is not only defeating the NATO-trained Ukrainian military, but in doing so, sapping the strength of NATO, which has basically bankrupted itself by providing tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment in a failed cause.
Here's a documentary put together by the Wall Street Journal about the field of battle. It basically, I mean, we cut it down, it's long, it's about 1 minute and 10 seconds, basically showing what the Wall Street Journal has discovered are part of the Russian defensive lines along the border of where the Russian troops have moved east in anticipation of, it won't be spring now, but of some sort of an offensive. I'll be anxious to hear your thoughts on this, Scott.
While Kyiv has been training its troops to use Western weapons, Russia has been building some of the most extensive defensive lines seen anywhere in the world in decades. The first layer of defense shown in many satellite images is the anti-tank ditch. The obstacle is meant to be too wide for a tank to cross, restricting an enemy's ability to maneuver and funnel their forces into areas that make them more vulnerable to attack. Next are rows of concrete blocks called Dragon's Teeth. They form a barrier that makes it difficult for heavy vehicles to pass through. And the third line is a trench. This is the most common type of defensive work and the easiest to construct. Russian forces dug many trenches along roads, junctions and bridges, and even on the beaches of Crimea. Most of them were built in a zigzag or angular pattern. Some military experts say these defense systems don't necessarily pose a major threat to the Ukrainians. They say whether the fortifications are effective would depend on the number of Russian troops defending them. And if Ukraine attacks defensive lines that aren't sufficiently protected, the Ukrainians will be able to bypass the obstacles with Western Challenger and Leopard battle tanks.
Makes sense to you, or Wall Street Journal propaganda?
Well, I'm confused about it. They're going to bypass the obstacles with all 14 of the Challenger 2 tanks they received from the British. I mean, this is absurdity in the extreme. Look, anybody knows that history shows that a well-planned offense, properly equipped, et cetera, can overcome just about any defense there is. The Russian defenses are designed to channelize and designed to complicate any potential Ukrainian action. But these trenches that they've shown are not, the end all when it comes to defense. So what's key is the personnel that are in the trenches, but more importantly, the firepower behind it. The whole idea here is to channelize and delay any Ukrainian offensive operation to put it into a kill zone that will then see hell come down from above and slaughter them. But these defenses were put together in the fall of 2022 when Russia had suffered, those defeats in the Kharkov and Kherson. So these were sort of rapid defenses. Russia's gone well beyond that today. Right now, they have intelligence and surveillance capability that's picking up the massing of Ukrainian forces dozens of kilometers behind the lines and destroying them before they even get close to the front lines. These guided bombs that the Russians are able to drop with impunity, the drones, the cruise missiles, these are destroying Ukraine's offensive capabilities before they get anywhere near the front lines. So these Russian defenses aren't even playing a factor in what's going on right now. What you're seeing here is typical Wall Street Journal. With all due respect to the guy who wrote it, he doesn't know anything about the military. He doesn't know anything about Russian defensive doctrine. He doesn't know anything at all. He's simply parroting words spoon-fed to him by people who have a bias, an anti-Russian bias. That's it.
One of the most horrific anti-Russian biases we've heard in recent days. I'm not sure if you were back in the U.S. or if you were still in Russia when this occurred, was South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham meeting in Kyiv with President Zelensky, saying lots of dead Russians, best money we ever spent. I would think that this is lunacy. This is just not normal for someone in the American government to say something like this in a public way to the leader of another country.
Yeah, let's remember who Lindsey Graham is. He's a war hawk. He's been promoting conflict for some time. But remember back when there was the Russian bounty? Remember that Russian bounty where the Russians were supposedly paying the Taliban to kill American soldiers? And how outraged Lindsey Graham was, how outraged he was over this. Well, it was all a lie. And Lindsey Graham knew it was a lie while he was being outraged. But now Lindsey Graham, this, this personification of moral clarity, apparently, according to him, you cannot pay to kill American soldiers, is bragging how Americans are paying to kill Russian soldiers. Right. This man is a soulless human being. He is not a representative of the country I took an oath to uphold and defend. He's a murderous slug who deserves his place on the pantheon of war criminals, up there with anybody, any bad name you want to put up there. It is not an American value to buy the deaths of anybody. Lindsey, if you are that kind of man, then man up. Rather than let the Ukrainians do the fighting for you. If you want to kill Russians, Lindsey, why don't you go to Congress and get a declaration of war so American boys and girls can cross the border, do it themselves? That's what real men do. That's what real men do, Lindsey, but you're not a real man. You're a mouse. You're a little pipsqueak of a human being who's letting other people do the fighting for you, and then your mouth goes crazy. Lindsey Graham is a disgrace to the United States. He's a disgrace to the United States Senate. He's a disgrace to the men and women in the armed services of the United States. Nobody should tolerate this kind of language. He should have been reprimanded by the U.S. Congress, but the fact that the Senate remained silent, the fact that the president remained silent, the fact that General Miley remained silent, the fact that anybody in uniform remained silent tells you the depths to which this nation is one.